James Wesley Rawls, expert on preparedness. He's written the book, How to Survive the End of the World as We Know It. Not the end of the world, the end of the world as we know it. World War II killed over 100 million people, including 20 million Germans in that collapse. Democide, governments killed over 260 million people in the last century. Government is the #1 cause of death, and government collapse is, well, the biggest for the Ukrainians and others.
Well, Alex, I'm a former Army intelligence officer, so I was involved with, among other things, some country studies looking at the fragility of some nations. And I came to realize that our own nation was even more fragile because we have a higher level of technological dependence. We have tremendously long chains of supply. And in recent years, we've adopted the Japanese Kanban school of inventory control, what they call just-in-time inventory or lean inventory control, where there's very little in the pipeline at any given time. And what you see on your supermarket shelves is basically all they have. There is no longer a back room with extra stock. What you see is what you get. And if the inventory control system breaks down for any number of different reasons, whether it's a transportation problem or a communications problem or just an internet problem, you're out of luck.
So we're 3 days from no food on the shelves in the studies I've seen from the Army, which I guess you were probably involved in. You can elaborate. 10 days from anarchy, 15 days from cannibalism.
About that, yeah. In fact, there's a bit of cannibalism described in my first novel. And when you come right down to it, human nature is pretty ugly. If you remove the trappings of modern society and law and order, there's just a thin veneer of civilization. And when you peel that back, what's underneath is kind of ugly. It doesn't take long at all before people revert to savagery. And that's one of the central themes of all of my writings. So that's why I encourage people to move to lightly populated areas and to team up with like-minded folks and to stock up in depth.
Well, you know, the media, the controlled corporate media and the globalist media, the occupied America media, they always demonize being prepared. But as you were pointing out, government itself and people that work in intelligence are obsessed with it now more than ever. And all the big money I know is leaving the United States, racing to mountainous areas, racing to islands. And even the news is reporting that. But we're still bad for being concerned.
Right. In fact, our government is essentially schizophrenic on the issue of preparedness. Because on the one hand, you've got the Department of Homeland Security labeling people who prepare as potential terrorists. At the same time, you've got FEMA encouraging everyone to stock up. So who do you listen to?
Oh, man.
And it's a classic socioeconomic collapse novel about hyperinflation, followed by a total collapse of society where the power grid goes down and there's massive depopulation of the major cities and lawlessness all over the country. I wrote that because I see it's actually a possibility. We live in a very fragile society with very long chains of supply, great dependence on technology, tremendous dependence upon the power grid. And if the grid were to go down for any number of different reasons, all bets are off. Although I don't have a really strongly conspiratorial view like some others, I do believe that we do have the threat of global governance. And the natural reaction of governments when there is a power vacuum or disruption is to clamp the lid down and institute total government. That's the very nature of government. And if there are risks out there that would cause major disruption, people have to be prepared not just for defending their own family home and providing for themselves, but also the prospect of waking up some morning and finding yourself under martial law. And the other thing that I stress in my writings is it's only the people that are well prepared that are going to be in a position to do anything about it. Everybody else is going to be worried about where they're going to find their next meal. So by stocking up, you can be part of the solution.
Most Americans now 90%, as you know, live in cities and are not self-sufficient. Of the 10% that are rural, I've seen numbers of only half being sufficient.
That's right.
And this is totally creepy because I've seen university numbers of 7 million dying of illnesses or malnutrition associated with the Depression, 7 million in a decade, and that 90% were rural then, or about 87%, and about half of those were self-sufficient. So we're looking at 45% that were self-sufficient then, 7 million dead. Imagine what's going to happen this time.
And that's with the power grid staying up. If the power grid goes down, all bets are off. If you look back at the Depression of the 1930s, you had a lot more people that were more closely connected to the land. Now we've got 2% of the population feeding the other 98%, literally. So if we were to see a grid-down societal collapse, most people don't have country cousins that they can depend on anymore. And the chains of supply are so long that we could see a massive depopulation. And if this were to happen, say, in the fall of the year, with power grid going down, if the grid didn't come back up quickly, by the next spring, we could see half of the population of the United States dead.
Best-selling author of fiction and nonfiction books, James Wesley Rawls is our guest. Survivors, a novel of the coming collapse, How to Survive into the World as We Know It, available everywhere, tactics, techniques, and technologies for uncertain times. But I think more than just having food and guns and water, you need to be around, like you said, neighbors that are ready as well for mutual defense, because
Absolutely.
I mean, we're talking about, I'm sure you've seen the Rockefeller Foundation award-winning movie based on the novel The Road, which from my study is very accurate with how humans would act within 15 days.
Yeah, it's kind of a bleak outlook, but yes, that is human nature at its core when you come right down to it. And that's why it is important that people team up. You need to form a neighborhood watch on steroids. You need to team up with your neighbors, like-minded friends, fellow congregants of your church, and plan. Figure out what skills exist within your group, cross-train each other, and for any skills that are missing, people need to go out and get that training and then come back and cross-train everyone else. You need to have at least one member of your very local community, I'm talking a cluster of houses, that is trained as an EMT or paramedic. And that's as simple as enough as joining a local volunteer fire department, and they'll give you the training free.
Yeah, even swim teams give you that. I mean, you can go to the fire department, you don't have to join usually, and they'll give free clinics on it.
Sure, yeah, they do CPR classes and everything else. It's important that people get the training to go with all this gear, that you need more than just the gear. You need the training that goes with it. Because owning a gun doesn't make you a shooter any more than owning a surfboard makes you a surfer. There's a lot of skill that you need to acquire.
You're right. We all need to constantly stay ready and also be mentally prepared. You know, think through scenarios and have defaults of what you're going to do in certain scenarios, so you're not thinking, what am I going to do?
If you're thinking through those problems as they happen, you're behind the power curve. You really need to plan ahead and train, prepare, lay in the logistics, team up with neighbors, establish good security before trouble comes your way. In the big city, the trouble will be there within 2 or 3 days. You won't have time to organize and prepare. Unfortunately, that's the whole statist mindset, which is they make everyone dependent, but then they don't have any guarantee of government services. If you look at places like Detroit, the response times, even for violent crimes, stretch out into hours. Well, if you have to wait hours before the police arrive, all they're basically good for is filling out paperwork and toting off the body bags. You have to depend on yourself. It's essentially yo-yo time. You're on your own.
Now, obviously, if a solar flare hit us directly, that could blow out a lot of the power grid. We've gone over the transformers and the rest of it. There could be a nuclear war. They're trying to start war with Iran right now. Russia and China are threatening. But for me, it's just the economic collapse that if we did have another depression, I mean, we're already seeing a lot of stuff unravel, and we saw the government couldn't take care of Katrina.
Now, you mentioned the power grid going down, and you mentioned EMP, and you mentioned solar flares, but there's one other way the power grid could go down that most people don't realize, and that is a malicious hacker attack could get into the SCADA software, which is the system control and data acquisition software that controls the power grid, all the way from the power plants and the hydroelectric dams all the way to your home power meter. There's SCADA software all the way in between now, and that's at risk. So yes, if the grid goes down, we're in big, big trouble.
If there's a 10% chance society's going to collapse, then we should all get prepared. And I got to say it's 50-50 right now. And governments are saying that. The head of the IMF said that last month. I mean, they're talking about a road warrior scenario. It's so great to have him here with us, one of the leading survivalist expert writers out there.
Well, I just see it as a logical progression. We live in a very fragile society. We have a system where our constitutional government is at risk. Anytime there's major disruption, there's always the possibility that someone may try to step in to, quote, restore order, unquote, and you end up with a government that's far, far worse, that you end up with total government. And I think people need to be vigilant, and if they're vigilant and well-prepared, they'll be in a position to hopefully speak up and do something about it. In a worst case, we could end up with a situation like I described in Patriots and in Survivors, where you end up with a power vacuum that's created by economic collapse, and a foreign occupying army comes in to restore order, and then you end up, as I described in Patriots, in a war of resistance, a guerrilla warfare situation where you're trying to restore constitutional government. God forbid we ever get to that point, but I think people need to be prepared even for that.
All right, let me stop you there. My frustration with great guests like yourself that are telling the truth is that everything you say, there's 50 points I want to make backing you up. But people can pull this up. NLEO 9, FEMA press release. 14 countries working with FEMA to drill on suppressing uprisings. John Ward Defense Authorization Act saying it's to suppress the states, the governor's councils, the rural councils, right out of Red Dawn, the tattletale squads, the clergy response teams. I mean, they're setting up for a suppression of civil war. And it looks like the globalists want to have that civil war with the American people, and they're going to call us the terrorist.
Well, it very well could be a big setup. I think, though, that the statists and globalists may be setting up a situation that's going to get out of their control. If they attempt to orchestrate a stock market collapse or a banking panic or something along that line, it could very well get away from them. They could end up with a situation where the rioting and looting gets completely out of control. Government agencies are unable or unwilling to respond. You could end up with individual police officers and firemen afraid to literally leave their home, leave their families unprotected, so they won't show up for work. That was what I described in Patriots.
And that happened in New Orleans.
Yeah, and you also ended up with police officers looting. Mm-hmm. Well, we could see a situation where, whether it's orchestrated or not, we could have a societal collapse. We could have things come completely unraveled. Again, the linchpin is the power grid. Things could come unraveled to the point where even someone who was hoping to be the one to come in and restore order and institute their brand of government, the situation could get completely out of their control. And we could see a complete unraveling where the cities become uninhabitable. Once the power grid goes down, there's about a 2 or 3 day supply of water in most civic water systems that's gravity-fed from tanks. But there are very few cities that have end-to-end gravity-fed water. They're almost all dependent upon the power grid. So if the grid goes down, the water stops flowing, the toilets stop flushing, and then suddenly you have a huge public health crisis on your hands. The cities become uninhabitable. Commerce comes to a halt. You have this mass exodus of people from the big cities, what I refer to as the Golden Horde, pouring out of the cities. And it's a situation where it's difficult to get the apple cart back on its wheels.
Yeah, so much time has gone into building the infrastructure that it works really well, but it's super delicate.
In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there were refugees as far as 400 or 500 miles away, and they brought this whole wake of a high crime rate with them, and that was just one localized area, essentially one big city that was badly affected. Imagine if every major city in the country simultaneously went through a major economic collapse and power grid failure. There's actually 3 power grids in the country, a western grid, an eastern grid, and a Texas grid. If the power grids go down, we could see major rioting and looting going on in virtually every urban area. And yes, there will be some pretty large ripple effects that come from that. I just pray that the majority of your listeners team up and be ready to hunker down. It means having a deep larder, being very well stocked up, very well trained, and having, keeping your radar up, basically, keeping an eye on the big picture, and being ready to at least rebuild, from the ground up, from your local area up, to reestablish commerce, reestablish law and order, and I mean constitutional law and order.
Well, I know that from previous events, when things get really bad, the police and others don't show up, and I cannot imagine what will happen. If the welfare checks didn't show up for a month, it would be burning cities. And then what's going to happen after the welfare class does burn down the city? Then there'll be even less infrastructure. It is going to be hellish. What about what we see in every government and what we've seen in Katrina and other cases where they don't help all the people that are in the Superdome? The military comes with the police under federal orders to go into $5 million houses and blows safe doors off the wall and take people's guns who were there with generators and food. What happens when the system comes to commandeer our food and guns? What happens when the armored vehicle with the police comes down your road to commandeer your storable food?
Well, statistically, the chances of that happening to any one of your listeners is pretty small, but it is a risk. But people need to have a contingency plan to bug out. Everybody, even if you have the very best retreat in North America and you're completely hunkered down in your bunker, you still need to have a plan B. You need to keep your bug-out bag ready and be ready to get out of Dodge, because the last thing you want to be doing is getting into a gunfight with the local police or with.
Yeah, no, you've got a fake cache of guns and food you give them. You act like you're mad that they got it. I mean, there are alternatives to fighting. It's smarter.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. We need to be wise as serpents and meek as doves. So, yeah, it makes sense to have a rusty old 30-30 and a shotgun to turn over to them if they come looking for them, and you have the majority of your better guns cached somewhere, well hidden, so that even if they, quote, clean you out, they're not going to have even the majority of it. They'll just have a small portion.
I wish this stuff wasn't true. And I'm so busy on air and doing the nightly news and trying to make films and trying to travel and all this stuff that, well, I'm going to be honest. I was planning to visit radio stations all over the country this year. And I'm going to go to Dallas to visit an affiliate and speak this Sunday. I'm pretty much looking at maybe not traveling any after that, because the collapse is so imminent if it's going to happen. And I was talking to James. I said, James, when do you think it could happen with the whole financial thing? And he gave me his answer. And this is a guy who predicted this with incredible accuracy 20 years ago and how it would start happening. And repeat to me, James, what you said.
Well, Alex, I think that there's a possibility that we could see a repeat of the 2008 financial crisis in the next few months as things come unraveled with the periphery of the EU. The Greek tragedy, as they're referring to it, could get out of control. We could see a banking crisis and a credit collapse that could go global. And if that happens, we could see virtually all the Western countries go down like dominoes. We could see a banking crisis, stock market collapses, collapse of bond markets. It could get very, very ugly. There's a huge number of derivatives in play. That's a huge imponderable, because that derivatives market didn't even exist 10 years ago. Now it's measured in the scale of hundreds of trillions of dollars notionally in derivatives in play at any given time. And the counterparty risk is huge. Well, what happens if one of those counterparties is a national government and that counterparty goes away? It's just unfathomable to know what could happen. And the risk is tremendous.
But again, it's just so creepy. It's one thing to know, hey, grandpa's got cancer, that he's going to be dead. And then 6 months passes and you're there at the deathbed and and they're dying in front of you. Or, hey, your buddy's in the hospital. He's, they're in a car wreck. He's probably not going to make it. You show up 5 minutes after you're there, the person dies in front of you. It's the slow motion of the New World Order and the twilight zoneness of world government being announced and coffee shop owners being said, call Homeland Security if somebody pays cash, and TSA groping women and saying they're not. James, I mean, do you not ever pinch yourself at how Twilight Zone-y this has gotten and then think, my gosh, we aren't even into this yet? Our hand isn't even all the way. We've kind of stuck our arm in the badger hole, and now we hear him growling. But he hasn't even bitten into our fingers yet. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see your point, Alex. We are kind of in a stage now, but I look at that of uncertainty. But I look at that as a period of opportunity where people can reorder their finances, get out of dollar-denominated assets and get into precious metals, where people can still go to a local gun show and buy a fully capable gun with no paperwork if they buy it from a fellow private party in most states. The window of opportunity for preparedness still exists, and the window of opportunity to warn others with venues like yours still exists. I think people should take full advantage of these opportunities while they can. We were talking earlier about what's your chances of finding something sophisticated like a night vision scope after everything falls apart. They're just not going to be available. So people should thank God that they have those opportunities to get prepared now. Now is the time to sell that flat panel television and sell your jet ski and go out and buy yourself an M1A. Buy yourself 6 months or a year's worth of food. You have the opportunity now. Grab the bull by the horns, because a couple of years from now, you'll be thanking yourself. In fact, your children will be thanking you. And if you don't, your children will be asking, why didn't you?
You want to get into preparedness? Let's get into the best firearms training areas, and then basics for people that do live in cities. If somebody can get to the country, give us the top 10 list of what to do to get ready, Mr. Rawls.
Well, I'd say even ahead of firearms, it's important to have a good quality water filter, like either a compact Katadyn filter, or for your house, a big ceramic filter like a big Berkey. Water filtration has to be the very top of your list, followed by food storage. But then, yes, you have to be ready to defend what you have, and I'm a big believer in .308 battle rifles. In terms of handguns, I'm a big believer in .45 automatics, and even though I was a real diehard 1911 shooter for many, many years, I finally made the transition, and I'm now recommending either the Glock Model 21, which is a .45 automatic, or the Springfield Armory XD 45. Both of those are high-capacity, 13-round .45 automatic pistols that are very, very reliable. Beyond that, of course, communications equipment, first aid gear, and all the training to go with it. For all this stuff, don't think just because you bought the gear that you're ready. You really need to train with it, practice with it, know it inside and out.
I agree with you. Expanding on that, what about the component of waking people up in your area so that they're aware of this threat? Even if they laugh at you up front, then once things unravel, they'll start listening to you. But then there's the catch-22. If they didn't get ready, they're not going to be prepared. They're going to be demanding you take care of them.
Well, that's why I recommend that people keep a low profile. I'm all for charity, and I think it's really important that people stock up. I have a 3-year supply for my family here at the ranch, but I don't look at that as a 3-year supply for one family. I look at that as a 1-year supply for 3 families. Be ready to dispense charity, but be ready to do so through an intermediary so you can keep a low profile. You want to dispense that charity through your local church, for example, quietly. You just get together with your church elders and say, okay, I've got some extra food. I want to make it available. I don't want my name to ever be mentioned. That's my take on charity.
Because you know the old African saying, no good deed goes unpunished.
Yes, and the old Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. So it's important that people do stock up in depth and be prepared. Stock up to the best of your ability, as best as your budget will allow. Team up with like-minded people in your church and your neighbors, your family members, whoever. Very quietly team up with your neighbors, stock up, train, cross-train with the skills that are available within your group. There's probably someone who's prior service, military. They can teach, small unit tactics and things like NBC. You probably have people that are firefighters or former firefighters that can teach everything from CPR to how to save a house from burning down. Even the oldest member of your local community that's in your group probably knows how to do home canning and all those old-fashioned skills. And they, again, can cross-train everyone else.
Looking at this, with the whole depression we're seeing, it's good to just have storable food in case things continue to collapse because you'll at least have food.
Sure. I often like to say that storage food is not just for the worst case, not just for a disaster. It's also for personal disasters. What if you get laid off? You're out of work for 6 months. Well, food is one item you're not going to have to worry about. You'll always have food on the table. Also, by buying in bulk when you buy your storage food, you're eating cheap. If you buy rice in little 1-pound packages at the store, you're paying 5 times the price you would pay if you buy it in the 50-pound sacks. So buy the 50-pound sacks, get some 5-gallon food-grade plastic buckets, and bucket it up yourself. It's common sense. It's a good old-fashioned skill, and it saves money.
I have one last question.
Win-win-win.
It is a win-win-win. I have one last question for you. I'm seeing a huge awakening, especially in the military and police. Do you see the same awakening that I'm seeing, and how does that factor in 1 minute?
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the growth of the preparedness movement, it's basically just doubling each year. Ever since Hurricane Katrina, it's been doubling. And there's a larger and larger percentage of our population that's catching on, that's waking up, and it's getting off their tails and doing something about it. All I can say is keep it up and spread the word. Get people listening to Patriot Radio. Get people teamed up locally and train together and stock up the best you can. That's the bottom line.
And I think that's why God's given us time, so that people like yourself and myself and many others who did have it put on our heart to get ready for this new world order and get laughed at, now it's all happening. Now people are finally listening because, unfortunately, we've been proven right.
That's right. Our window of opportunity is closing. So make the very best of the time available to stock up and get your beans, bullets, and Band-Aids together.